Hello, everybody. Welcome to the LinkedIn Live. I'm Kim Scott, and with me I have Eliot Higgins, who is the founder and creative director of Bellingcat. Welcome, Eliot.
Hi, Kim. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you. I had a great time working with your team, and I so deeply admire the work that Bellingcat does. So for folks who aren't familiar with Bellingcat, can you explain a little bit about what you all are doing and why?
Sure. So Bellingcat really came out of a hobby of mine that I started back in 2012, looking at videos and photos and stuff coming from the Arab Spring, where I was engaged with basically arguments on the internet about what was happening. But I found it very frustrating that the arguments weren't really about the evidence. They were about people's opinions, and the evidence was just used to beat each other over the head with it and be interpreted in different ways.
Yeah.
So I wanted to know what was actually going on in these places. And because the kind of spread of the internet and smartphones allowed people to, share videos from these conflict zones constantly.
Yeah.
One of the questions was, how do you actually prove where they're filmed so they're telling the truth? So I realized you could use satellite imagery and other sources to basically spot the difference between these videos and photos and things like satellite imagery to find the exact location. And that started me on a journey that eventually led me to developing a whole set of tools and methodologies for what we call open source investigation, using publicly available information to understand a range of situations. And Bellingcat was my attempt to really do two things. One is create guides, case studies, and ways to teach people how to do it, and also do the investigations itself. And that has gone from really what was just me and my laptop to now we have an international organization. We work on a whole range of different topics. We educate, we develop theories and processes, and we really kind of lead the way in the way open source investigation is done.
I love it. And I think it's so interesting that that's when you started, because I think the Arab Spring maybe was the height of techno-utopianism, right? We thought, we've created these platforms. We're all talking to each other peer to peer. There's no more centralized control. And kind of, as it turned out, more or less the opposite was true. So talk a little bit about, or maybe you disagree with what I just said.
No, absolutely. I mean, certainly the reaction I got from the likes of Google, for example, was really positive early on. I was just like some blogger, and they had no reason to pay attention for me. But because I was using YouTube and Google Earth and their tools to do this, they found that really exciting. And certainly in 2013, for them, they felt that they were having a positive impact on the Arab Spring. That this is a great example of our tools being used.
Twitter did too.
Yeah, and then basically I was invited to the Google buildings, saw their Lego room and all that sort of stuff. But then ISIS comes along, and suddenly these social media platforms start realizing, oh, actually, this can be used for some quite bad stuff as well. So there was this kind of real moment where this inflection point where they realized actually this isn't always good. This
it can be quite dangerous.
Yeah.
Well, Eliot, I love great visuals, and you have some really insightful ways to talk about disordered information or fractured information. So why don't you share some of that with folks? And then if it's okay, I'll just interrupt you when I have questions.
Sure, absolutely. So to set the kind of ground for this a bit, in my work, I've worked on topics like chemical weapon use in Syria, the shooting down of Malaysian Airlines Flight 17 in eastern Ukraine, all kinds of stuff from Russia. And I always found there would be communities online who existed in an alternative reality that they kind of had constructed around themselves. And I was wondering why that keeps happening. And a few years ago, I watched a documentary called Behind the Curve, which was about the Flat Earth movement. And watching that, I realized they were just the same fundamentally as all these other groups. There was this deep sense of distrust. They'd organized around it. And I just realized this is actually all something that's kind of emerging from the kind of information system we live in. So I was thinking about this a lot. And I think one thing we have to really think about to begin with are the fundamentals of kind of like the ideals of democracy. Why is democracy even important? What are we actually trying to achieve? So I come up with kind of three broad ideals of democracy based off the various philosophy and ideas around it. So first is the idea of verification. We attempt to verify what is true versus what is false. that we do it through the scientific method. We do it through careful study and research. We have editorial control.
Free speech kind of is part of verification, right?
Yeah, so it's then leads us to the next stage, which is deliberation, where we discuss this stuff.
Right.
And in a democracy, the ideal is that everyone is working off verified information or the best information they can get to have a reasoned discussion that's inclusive.
Yeah.
And then that leads to the accountability, where action is taken based off that, and that those people who stray outside of what's considered the democratic norms are punished. So if you break the law, you're punished. If you're corrupt, you're punished. And those are ideals of democracy.
Yeah.
Now,
and if you lie, maybe even you're punished. Disinformation is punished.
Well, yeah, this is it. This is it exactly. So when false information is spread, it's corrected. And the problem is no democracy ever meets those ideals. It's impossible by human nature itself and just the way we're structured. No one can be kind of fully informed about the world around them. And I like to look at the work of a guy called Walter Lippmann, who came up with the idea of manufacturing consent. So I titled this Demanufacturing Consent because it's really about how consent is becoming fractured. So Walter Lippmann comes up with this book in 1922, Public Opinion. And there he's looking at how public opinion is actually formed.
And he's the guy who coined the medium is the message, right?
Yeah, so this is very much about how we have to understand the information system we exist in has changed. So one thing he was talking about is the idea of pseudo environments, that we create environments in our minds based off the information we receive. And the thing is, the world in a mass media society especially is so huge and complicated that no one can really understand every single thing that's going on, which they have an opinion and a way to act on in a democracy by voting. So basically, we have a real version of the world, and then we have mass media as a lens, mass media that's controlled by gatekeepers, the editors, the owners, and then that's given to the public. And the public build a version of the world based off that that's imperfect, simplified, but broadly shared. And that's important because within that broad understanding of what the world is, we create a public discourse that allows for democratic action, as flawed as it is.
Yeah.
And this is something over the next kind of 80 years or so, there was a lot of political theory done about. But something changed about 15 years ago.
So can I ask, sorry, before we go on to what changed, can we go back?
Sure.
Like this seems both a good thing and a bad thing. Like, and I don't want to be too binary, but is this a positive or a negative? Like, because this could be controlled. This feels like it can be controlled pretty easily. Like is this world that we're looking, the old world, the world of three networks, everybody's watching more or less the same news every night. Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
It's both in some senses. So in the form of building consensus, it's a good thing. But also if you're outside of the consensus, you don't have access to that.
Yeah.
And this is why we saw, in the 60s and 70s, what Nancy Fraser calls counterpublics forming. Yeah. That you actually have these separate media ecosystems being created, and information systems around ideas of race and feminism and civil rights. And what happens is that eventually those counterpublics are absorbed. Yeah. Eventually, and usually through legislation and significant changes in the world.
Kind of democratic process if you're in a democratic.
Yes. And this is the problem we have nowadays, because we had the introduction of the iPhone in 2007. This led to a huge boost in the use of social media. Facebook, in a few years, I think 5 years, it went from about 50 million users to 1 billion users worldwide. And that was enabled by the spread of smartphone technology. But this actually changed dramatically the information ecosystem we live in. So if you look at the old model where we had, the mass media lens we were seeing the world through, what we now actually have is a fracturing where everyone finds media information that serves their interests and fuels their biases. Yeah. And the problem is this means that we no longer have one shared, as imperfect as it is, version of reality. It's splintered. And this is why we start finding people who, even in our own lives, seem to exist in a completely different version of the world. Yeah. And this isn't just about you watch Fox News and I watch CNN. It's about entire information ecosystems and sets of values being formed around these ideas.
Yeah, yeah. Like if we go back to the flat earthers, I was talking to a guy who's a mathematician, and he said, their math is actually pretty sophisticated. It's wrong, but a lot of people that they can't tell it's wrong, and it's right. There's enough that's right about it that it can fool a lot of people. So even in something that you would think is pretty objective math, we're getting these different lenses.
Absolutely. And it's like with the flat earth movement, their core value is the earth is flat. So when they do these experiments and it proves that it's wrong, they think, oh, I've done the experiment wrong because my core value cannot be incorrect.
Yes.
So this then leads to what I call the creation of disordered discourse. It's an emergent property from the way these information systems have changed. So I say there's 4 dimensions of disordered discourse, and this builds on the work of Claire Wardle and others on what's called information disorder. So we have 4 dimensions. The first are the elements. So these are the kind of raw materials of disinformation, you could say. Then you have the drivers. So why do people share the elements of disordered discourse? And the agents, who are the people sharing them? And then finally, how the discourse itself is formed and created. So the elements of disordered discourse are fortunately quite straightforward. The first is misinformation. And it's very important to be clear about these definitions because frequently they're used interchangeably, and that doesn't help. So misinformation is false or misleading information spread without the intent to deceive, often by people who believe it to be true. And that's really, really important. And that's different from disinformation because that, again, is false and misleading information, but it's deliberately created and spread to manipulate, deceive, or mislead. And so often we use those terms interchangeably in society. And what it leads people to feel is they're being attacked for their true beliefs, even if those beliefs are untrue.
Yes.
And so first we have a challenge of even language. I was just at the Cambridge Disinformation Summit, which was a great gathering, but it was really apparent that even within a community who are engaged with this topic, those 2 words are constantly used interchangeably. And then there's a third type as well. Most people haven't heard of this, malinformation. So it's true information manipulated or framed misleadingly to deceive, mislead, or cause harm. So it could be a leaked email that is recontextualized to kind of make you look bad, for example. And that's certainly something I think most people are familiar with.
So can I ask you a question before we move on?
Sure.
If there's a person who is spreading false information, maybe they don't believe it, but the reason they're spreading it is to make money off it. Not any, just because it happens to it's clickbait, Is that information or disinformation?
That would be disinformation because they are attempting to mislead people
deliberately. Well, they don't really want to mislead. They want to make money.
Yeah, and I've got an example of that. I'll show you in a minute, which is very unusual, I think you'll find.
Okay.
But first we'll look at the drivers, because this is actually what often gets misunderstood. So often when we think about disinformation or misinformation, or whichever word you prefer, people think of, it's a foreign actor like Russia lying to the public with bot networks or fake news websites and tricking us. And that's why we have this stuff. But it's far, far more complicated than that, unfortunately. So I break it into 3 main groups. First, these structural and technological drivers. So this is things like algorithmic amplification, monetization, and the incentives that creates, the decline of the traditional gatekeepers, i.e. the kind of traditional media, for example, and the fragmentation of the information ecosystems. We have the psychological and social drivers. So cognitive biases and motivated reasoning, doctrine enforcement and purity testing, identity and community reinforcement, and crisis catalyst and fear-based thinking. And then political and economic drivers, which are weaponization by state and political actors, astroturfing and covert operations, policy and legal failures, and polarization and media fragmentation. And these often all act together in different ways in each individual, in each group, in each community. So understanding that is something that's really important, rather than pointing the finger at Russia and saying it's all their fault.
Really important point.
So I have an example here where This is a revealing of it about myself. So there's a YouTube channel called Hoof GP, and it's a guy in Scotland who goes around fixing the hoofs of cows. And it's one of those kind of strangely hypnotic YouTube channels for probably people like me. It's a little bit gross, but also quite relaxing seeing their hoofs get fixed. So it's kind of like he gets lots of subscribers. He sells T-shirts. He's quite successful by doing this. But I watch these videos quite regularly, so I get the algorithm recommending me more videos like it. And there's other guys like Nate the Hoof Guy, and there's a whole world out there that you probably didn't even know about until now. But I started getting some really weird recommendations, like videos on a channel called Cleaning Hoof Action. And it doesn't have many subscribers, even that many views, but they have cow hoofs being cleaned. But on this image, I've blurred them out because they're so disgusting, covered in nails, maggots, all kinds of stuff. And there's one like this called John Hoof Care, John spelled Jonh, with clearly AI-generated imagery. And you can see in the previews just nails sticking out the sides of these cow hoofs. Another one, this is a Vietnamese channel that actually says it's a weather channel, but now it's covered in gross-looking hoofs. And weirdly, one of the images has P. Diddy in it as well, in the preview image, alongside a hoof. The reason they're doing this is because they're trying to capture algorithmic recommendations from Hoof GP. And because he gets millions of views, and these are all videos coming from Vietnam, where the average monthly wage is about $400 a month. So a viral video could make someone on these channels a huge amount of money. And what they're actually doing is they're buying the legs of cows from butchers, dressing them up, and then cleaning them for engagement. So this is where you have the algorithmic incentive and the monetization incentive. They aren't trying to, change people's political opinions, but they're using disinformation to make money off people. And if you look at what they used to post, it's things like heavy machinery videos or cleaning the side of sidewalks. And what you actually see happening is if there's a successful video, like you see these rust cleaning videos, carpet cleaning videos, this may say more about my internet history than I want to let on. But
you like things plain.
Well, people then, what they do is make fake versions of those videos to capture the algorithmic recommendations. And this is a kind of a strange kind of emergent behavior from just how these platforms operate.
And I guess that with AI, this will become much easier and fast. They won't have to buy real hooves from slaughtered cows. They can just, use AI.
Technology. I mean, already on those channels, I was seeing AI-generated business advice videos where they clearly got ChatGPT to write it, recorded it with an AI voice, and stuck AI images over it. So people are grifting constantly online, trying to game those algorithms. But what it means is the internet is just flooded with nonsense and fake information.
Yeah.
So next we have the agents of disordered discourse. And there's 4 key agents that I described. So one is the official state, political and government actors. So these are, the governments, the reports they put out, the statements they make. But this is when they're lying to us in this instance. But then there's the proxy state, political and government actors. So these would be, for example, Russia Today, state TV, in the more overt way, but covertly there's things like the Internet Research Agency who do influence campaigns. It's also captured media. So you might argue, for example, Fox News is captured media working on behalf of the MAGA movement at the moment. Then you have self-interested actors. So these are individuals like the fake hooves people, for example, who just have their own interests. And they can be, that could be like you just retweeting a funny political video, or maybe something suggesting maybe Donald Trump is featured in a particular videotape, for example. It's funny, but it's also not true. And you kind of know it is, but you're sharing it because you kind of want to engage people with it.
Yeah.
Partly because it's funny, but it's still not true.
Yeah.
All the way up to people who are like full-on grifters, just lying and churning out content for their own interest.
So the self-interested actor could be anything from a teenager wanting more likes in their social media feed to somebody in Vietnam who makes $400 a month trying to supplement their income with fake hoof cleaning.
Yeah, and all the way up to kind of Andrew Tate and people with really big online followings. It's just about getting money from people, really.
Yeah.
And then at the center of that, you have true believers, the people who really believe this, the people who say that the earth is flat and they are sure of it. that Assad didn't use chemical weapons, that Ukraine shot down MH17.
That nobody ever landed on the moon.
Exactly. And usually when we thought about this in the past, certainly post 2016, I would say, it's those kind of first three actors influencing the true believers. But really what you have is almost systems that are constantly interacting and reinforcing each other.
Yeah.
And it's the true believers who are often the engines of this, because when the other three actors have kind of lost interest or aren't interested in the first place, they kind of go away and do something else. But the true believers are still there, telling each other that they're right and patting each other on the back and producing more and more content around their chosen subject.
And also often producing content that gets reactions from people who are not true believers. So it does well algorithmically.
Well, yeah, this is the algorithmic drivers. That this is one of the things that's often hard to tell a true believer between and a self-interested actor. Yeah. Because it's very hard to tell the difference between their behavior types. It's really about their intent and motivations and the drivers behind that and understanding what those are.
And who knows what those are. Yeah.
That's right. And often when we're kind of approaching, the issue of countering disinformation, it's very much focused on the actors, the agents, rather than the drivers behind them. And that's why inevitably a lot of these things like fact-checking websites fail, because it's just missing the kind of correct target, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
So next, we have the stages of how disordered discourse is actually created. So we have the elements, the drivers, and the agents. So this is what they get up to. So it begins with people asking questions. Everyone asks questions, and they ask questions on the internet all the time. Yeah. And you get answers in terms of, engage with content. It's links, recommendations. It's what the algorithm tells you. But the thing is, your own personal biases will inform what you click on and what the algorithm serves you and what you search for. It also, informs the algorithm what other people like you want to find. So engagement itself creates disordered discourse by informing the algorithm. That's not to say you shouldn't engage with stuff, but just to explain the nature of this.
Yeah, I think also the thing I noticed about engagement is that all of us, I think, we have all kinds of different biases, but there's some we share. And one is a negativity bias. We tend to pay more attention to things that either surprise us, that we think are wrong, or things we think are bad or depressing. And that's really insidious.
And that then informs the algorithm to serve more content to everyone who it's thinking. So it's poisoning our minds effectively.
Yeah, it's depressing us.
Yeah, and then you engage with the information, and you might be drawn into the group, and you start forming a group identity around these subjects. That I'm someone who believes the Syrian government didn't use chemical weapons, or I'm someone who thinks Donald Trump is completely blameless and all the crimes are false. That group identity then leads to institutionalization of this identity, that you start having websites form, people who are the experts of the communities, the thought leaders, the influencers, but also a set of basically rules in the community that if you stray outside of those rules, then you become an enemy of the community because it's so institutionalized that if you start saying, oh, maybe Assad didn't use chemical weapons in this incident, or he did in this one, you'll get attacked because you're straying outside of the groupthink.
Yeah.
And finally, that creates the final stage, which is discourse absolutism, where you are fully absorbed into the discourse and that it becomes the lens through which you see the entire world. And everything.
You're no longer allowed to ask questions, interestingly. The thing at the center then disappears.
That's right. And you become completely enclosed by discourse, which is constantly fed to you, constantly reinforced. And this can include, the flat earth movement and all these other people we've talked about, QAnon, MAGA, and so on and so forth. And that's incredibly poisonous for democracies.
Yeah.
So I can give an example where someone did a survey of QAnon followers and asked them why they believed in QAnon. What actually got them involved in
Eliot, just to clarify, this is not your QAnon. This is somebody else's QAnon story.
Yeah, this is a study. It's a survey. It's a survey they did where they said, how did you fall down the QAnon rabbit hole? So he realized that from all the stories, there are three main factors that always came up. First, it always began with a distrust of the establishment. But that distrust came from a whole range of different things. It came from, Gamergate or the JFK assassination. They were libertarians, or, they had heard about Waco or Ruby Ridge, a whole range of reasons to distrust it. For a whole, range of drivers is a way you could think of it.
Or just they're skeptical people, which shouldn't be a bad thing. I mean,
no, it shouldn't. It's always good to have a little bit of distrust, but it's how you act on that distrust. Because what happens often is people have encounter what you notice next was there's a huge crisis. That can be a personal crisis, a political, social, but it's something that kind of makes them really start reinforces that distrust and start seeing it more and more everywhere in their life, and that leads them to do their own research online. So they find a whole network of information they start exploring, and that's where it starts getting bad. So there's a few examples here. So here's one example. So 9/11 was the seed. That's the crisis that codified it. And these are not my words. I will just reiterate. The Israeli art project in the Twin Towers clinched it for me. Down the rabbit hole I went. So that's nurtured by the internet. The Kenyan being elected and the world apology tool. So it's a distrust of the establishment. And that's the same kind of story told over and over again. The version of it might be different, but those core elements, those distrust, crisis, and doing your own research is a huge, huge part of it.
And I bet as people are listening to you there, they're thinking of a family member or a classmate who fell down the rabbit hole and wondering how they can help pull them out. So maybe you'll get to that later or not.
Well, unfortunately, these rabbit holes get really deep. I mean, I've got an image here of QAnon shaman with his full getup on, but the problem is once you're within this discourse, it's really hard to reach people because
it's like a cult.
Yeah, effectively, it's really interesting if you look at, read about how cults are formed, how many elements of that are reflected by these communities.
Yeah.
Another way to look at this is a kind of pyramid of radicalization, as I call it. So I'm sure many people listening to this podcast and this live stream will know that that they had questions about COVID vaccines. Perfectly fine to ask questions. So you go into Google and you say, are vaccines safe? And you might see results that say having vaccines all at once might be a problem. So some of you might be like, well, I trust medical professionals. I'm not going to click on that nonsense. But there'll always be a subset of people who do. And that subset of people will be served by the algorithm a set of information, links that will have slightly more extreme information in it, like vaccines can actually make you sick. So you click on that, and now it's saying that vaccines are actually designed to make you sick. And again, some people will say, no, that's nonsense. But other people, based on those drivers, especially the trust drivers, will click. And now they're reading that Bill Gates wants to put microchips in your vaccines. And now the 5G towers will activate the microchips. And the thing is, although it's a small percentage of people who get to the kind of tip of the pyramid, you do have real world impact. So, for example, 77 cell phone towers burnt down by May 2020 in the UK because of the 5G conspiracy theory. Real world impacts of basically disordered discourse.
Yeah. Yeah.
So this is where it gets really scary. So next I was thinking of how institutions are captured by disordered discourse. So institutional capture is the process by which disordered discourse is absorbed into the core functions of power when governments, media, and other institutions begin to reflect, amplify, and institutionalize disordered narratives, eroding the foundations of progressive democracy. And I would think it's fair to say this is exactly what's happened in the US. And it's scary because first you need to kind of think about how this happens in the first place. So one example I like to use is the Dominion voting debacle, as I like to call it. So those drivers are still present in the institutions. They have their own desires of what they want to get out there. So a process begins where first the institutions are exposed to these ideas. So imagine you're sitting pal and you get an email from someone telling you that Dominion voting systems have been hacked or are being abused. And Sidney Powell then thinks, oh, that's true, and takes it off to Fox News. And Fox News is looking for a way to, have a story that's pro-Trump about the election. And suddenly they've got what's supposedly a serious person telling them that Dominion has done this terrible thing. So their incentives align. It's not the same incentives, but they are in alignment. Then they start integrating that into their own narrative. So Fox News starts pushing out this story that Dominion has fixed the election. And then that starts capturing the behavior, because all of a sudden their audience wants more and more information on this. And we can see from the emails that from the Dominion legal case against Fox News that Fox News executives knew this wasn't true, but because their audience wanted it and they were losing their audience to Newsmax, they had to keep on having this because they were worried about losing advertising revenue. So it captures their behavior. And it then gets to the point when it gets embedded within the structure of their organization, that they make decisions based off the behavioral capture that means that's embedded in their organization. And I think that's pretty fair to say that a lot of what we see in the Trump White House is a result of what we're seeing here.
It's, when I was in college, a friend of mine wrote an essay, his thesis on the right not to be lied to. He wanted to pass a new amendment in the U.S. on the right. And it seems like maybe he was right. I thought it was kind of silly at the time, but this is insidious.
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing is, the platforms are designed around engagement, not the truth.
Yeah.
And what engages is scary stuff, it's sexy stuff, and stuff that makes you laugh. And believe me, there's a lot of that on the internet. And the problem is, when this captures institutions, it starts informing the way they actually operate. And this is where it becomes a huge, huge problem for democracy.
Yeah. I mean, and again, it seems like, from what I understand, even from when my kids were little and I was studying how they were learning, what tends to capture our attention is something that we think might be wrong. And so it seems like our skepticism is being weaponized in these, because we're paying more attention to something that we think might be wrong. Then we get served more of it, and then we get convinced it's right.
That's exactly right. And that leads to a situation where if your institutions are captured by that, it creates huge problems, because you then have this cycle happening. Because the discourse isn't true, problems are identified in a distorted manner. And then the solutions that are created to those fictional problems are flawed. But because the discourse doesn't allow you to say, oh, we were wrong, you have to deny that it was your fault, that the failure it's not my fault. So they externalize the blame, which further radicalizes the group and the discourse.
It's a cycle.
And I think you can see this happening a lot in various states that have been captured by disordered discourse. And what this leads to is what I call regressive democracy. So verification becomes replaced by distortion, deliberation becomes replaced by division, and accountability by deflection.
And then we get autocracy.
Yeah, and we have this slide happening across the world at the moment, and it's sad to say this is exactly what's happening in the US at the moment.
Yeah. Well, Eliot, what is the solution?
So it's really thinking about the fundamentals.
By the way, as you were talking the whole time, I was like, your talk needs to be shown in every high school in the country right now. Like, kids really need to understand this. I mean, we all need to understand this, but I have 16-year-old twins, and it's always horrifying to me, the stuff they come up with online.
Well, part of the solution is starting with young people, because we've had this shift in the information system from this top-down gatekeepers model to this peer-to-peer model. We're not just recipients of information like we're in the old system, but we're participants in its spread and creation. And that doesn't start with a newspaper editor making a decision. It starts with a 11-year-old picking up a smartphone, looking at social media for 5 seconds, and the algorithm noticing that's what an 11-year-old wants. And we aren't teaching critical thinking skills at school at all, really. And we need to embed that into all education, not just as an add-on lesson, but actually within the subjects themselves. So I'm already talking to groups that are doing this in terms of creating educational material for a large number of schools and for places. So there is work being done there. But the work that's being done across different groups isn't really kind of synced up at the moment. There's really great work that's being done. So I was speaking to someone called Carl Miller, who does a lot of work on disinformation. He's published a few books on it. And his project at the moment is called Waves, where he's working with local communities to help them understand the issues in their communities, make decisions, and connect to local councils in the UK. He's running a program there. So that's democratic engagement. And for me, democratic engagement is essential. The problem is we live in societies where there's 2 types of freedom. There's negative freedom. So that's the freedom from interference, really. You're freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion.
Yeah.
And then there's positive freedom, which is actually the empowerment to be part of the systems that serve you. And the problem is we're really, really good at giving people negative freedom, and we don't really give them positive freedom. And what that actually leads to are huge amounts of problems in terms of a feeling of disempowerment. I also think you have the issue of we live in societies that are really meritocracies. That the idea if you work hard, you will get rewarded for it.
Yeah.
The problem is that's not really true, because there's lots of people who work hard their own lives and they are still treated like garbage.
Yes.
I mean, at the moment, we're having a whole thing with care home workers in the UK who work so hard and they're being targeted by the government because of immigration issues and stuff like that. And it's kind of like saying, if you've got a degree, if you've got a doctorate, if you're successful, then you're a better person than someone who's worked hard their whole life but hasn't got those, the money, the status, the stuff. It's all getting more stuff. And then that interacts with an idea of digital feudalism. So it's the idea that we're actually moving away from a capitalist society into what we call digital feudalism, where the platforms actually start becoming the kind of land in which we work, in a way. So we all become serfs on that land. When you're online, you think you're a free individual, you're free to do whatever you want, go online, create content. But it's the algorithms, in a sense, that are the bailiffs of that. They decide who gets the attention, what the rules are.
Yeah.
So you're working in a system that's actually exploiting your labor. And you don't even realize it, because you think I'm building my own career, but your data's being taken, your engagement's being taken. It's like on Amazon, it's not a free marketplace. It's algorithmically designed to maximize the profit from the sellers.
Yes. Yeah.
And when you combine all of these together, you have people who are chasing engagement, and engagement is based on sexy, fear, and fun. And then when that happens, it's not about the truth. It's just about getting people to follow you, like, and subscribe, in the hope that you'll just get enough income from this. And we're all being exploited in these systems. And the thing is, we need to kind of start thinking, how do we become participants in democratic systems?
Yes.
So what I've been working on is basically 8 tracks of areas where we're trying to move towards these democratic ideals, even if we don't realize we're doing it, of verification, deliberation, and accountability.
I love it. And I think that, so at a bunch of years ago now, one of my jobs was policy enforcement for YouTube, DoubleClick, and AdSense. And I was invited to be a guest lecturer at a class, and the professor of the class, it was a class called Liberation Technology, and the professor of the class was a moral philosopher. And when I was explaining to him my job, he looked at me and he was like, "That's your job? You're in charge of that?" And he sort of was horrified. And at first I was kind of offended. I'm like, my intentions are so good, and I'm not a complete idiot. But I realized he was right. Like, his point was that some of the policies for what we see, and what is disinformation and what is misinformation and what is truth, need to be democratically decided, not decided by some random person, no matter how good her intentions, who happens to have a job at a big tech company. And I think that is really important. I mean, I started my career actually at the FCC. Right out of business school, I worked at the Federal Communications Commission. And that was started by FDR because he realized how dangerous it was if one person or one big company controlled a big chunk of the media. And, there was also at that point some understanding of how Hitler was misusing the radio to gain control. And so I believe in my core and how important democratic institutions can be for governing these systems. But it's not clear what exact policies. Like right now, there's a move to overturned Section 230 of the Telecommunications Act, which holds telecom, tech platforms, unaccountable for what's on their platforms. And maybe 2 years ago would have been all for overturning 230 and restoring, but now it seems like a dangerous time. So what's the way forward?
Yeah, it's really, I think, understanding that because this is really a whole societal issue, we need to approach it like that. But no one organization or even one government can do it by itself. What I'm doing at the moment is mapping out organizations across these 8 tracks I've developed in areas like education, kind of discourse creation, civic empowerment, institutional integration. See who's doing actually work in that already, and then looking at a way to bring them together in the same room and look at how they can collaborate. Because really what we're trying to build are systems that, for example, you go to school, K to 12, part of your education is critical thinking skills. So you already have resilience built into you. You go to university, and what Bellingcat's doing at the moment is creating course material for universities to teach open source investigation and investigative hubs. So students can investigate things they're interested in. That then connects to local media and communities who, like the Waves Project, for example, are already engaged with democratic processes that you're feeding verified information into, but also responding to their needs and interests in terms of what they want to find out more. And then that feeds into the accountability processes through policy, through legislation, even through legal processes. And we need to kind of create those systems because they exist. The parts of them exist. It's kind of, you've got all the cogs of the machine laid out in front of you, but you need to put that machine together for democracy.
Yeah. Well, Daniel, who is listening in, says the fact that an 11-year-old has a phone in the first place is an issue. And I would say yes and no. I mean, as I mentioned, I have twins. They're 16, and I swore, I'm not going to give them a phone at least until 8th grade. But then COVID happened, and I found that that they were isolated from their friends, and friends of mine who did manage to not give their kids phones until they went to high school found it had a huge negative impact on their, and so without laws that that prevent least common denominator, because that's what you're up against. Like, as a parent, you don't want your kid not to be able to communicate with their friends. That is not good for your child. And at the same time, you don't want your child to have a phone. Like, it's pretty tricky, actually. So, like, one great law would be no phones in schools. Like, that would take the burden off the schools. It would take the burden off the parents, and that would help a ton. Another one would be something like no behavioral targeting for advertising. Like, just can't do it. But I don't know. What do you think, Eliot?
Well, I think there's the recent examples from the book on Facebook, which I'm...
Yes, the careless people.
That's it. Yeah, it's where Facebook was selling to advertisers the ability to serve beauty and weight loss products to teenagers who just deleted a photograph of themselves.
It's so angry,
awful, and exploitative. That is exactly the kind of behavior that requires algorithmic transparency. Yeah. That's really what should be legislated against. Targeting children with algorithms, I think, is basically a form of abuse by the social media platforms.
Yes, I agree. I wish there was a class action lawsuit against Meta. It's just everything they do makes parenting much harder. The amount of unpaid labor I have to do as a parent as a result of their decisions is infuriating. I mean, and that's the least of the problems. There are other parents whose children have wound up harming themselves, getting bullied.
It's difficult as well to deal with social media companies because their whole business model is built around engagement and the algorithm. And if you say stop having an algorithm, it's like going to a drug dealer and saying take the cocaine out of your milk powder. It's like their whole product is the addictive substance.
But Coca-Cola used to have cocaine, and it no longer does. And
I think we need to really look at this as a sort of addiction. And I think because it's not drugs or alcohol, it's online stuff. It's kind of like, well, that's not real addiction, but you still get the same kind of dopamine kicks. I mean, I've struggled with my use of social media in the past, I will say. I quit Twitter about 6 months ago, And honestly, it was like I had withdrawal symptoms. Basically, the methadone I had was Blue Sky. So I got my kind of hit from that. But I was honestly shocked by the impact it had on me. I felt actually depressed because
it's real addiction. Yeah.
So I think that's, I mean, it affects everyone as well. And we need to really start thinking about things in terms of how addictive this is, how the algorithm is actually causing so much damage to our society, not just in terms of addiction, but just the behavior of how democracy functions.
Yes. Well, Eliot, I could talk to you for another hour, but I think our time is up. Thank you so much. Your explanations are so clear. I love your models. I feel like I understand the world a little bit better now. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks for having me on.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.